Hello. This is our second video for the Introduction to Sociology class. You guys did a great job on the discussion board for the mommy deployment. A lot of you caught on to much of the major themes. There's a couple things I wanted to say about that before we move into the setup for our next article. One is that the Ziff article isn't making a statement about whether surrogacy in general is exploitative or not. Just that in a specific case, it could or could not be. Another way to put it is that Ziff feels like that the discussion of exploitation being unilateral for surrogates often is in direct dissonance with some of the voices of people who do surrogacy. So it's more that, like, rather than making a clear ethical stance, it's that we should to some degree give voice to the people who actually do it. Listen to what they're saying, because in a lot of cases, like surrogacy is openly exploitation, and the people who are surrogates would understand it as such. And these are things like a lot of the international surrogacy trade. Sometimes a lot of surrogacy is actually done by people who are enslaved, things like that. Particularly like with other countries, and in the fact that like people will outsource their pregnancy who have nothing wrong with them to somebody from another country, right, who then gets paid to basically carry their child because they don't want stretch marks or something, right? So like in a lot of cases, surrogacy can be exploitative. The kinds that we're seeing in the mommy deployment are less so, and so it just wants to sort of like I guess like do sort of this like ethnological study, like get in there and sort of like see what is it that the narratives, how do they talk about it, how do they understand the role of being surrogate. And that's where a lot of these military metaphors that you guys picked up on came from. So that's just, we could also tie the article, the argument that Ziff is making about women's voices in surrogacy very close to some of the third wave feminism we were looking at before when we talked about gender. Right, so it's an application of that kind of narrative. So what we see very much so this. Let's move away from very like straightforward victim narrative about women, and instead like actually look at how women utilize their position in one way or another. Something that we would have assumed would be a form of exploitation may not be. It may be. You can't prejudge it before you actually sort of dig in and look at it. So those are just some comments on the discussion board, but overall you guys did a great job. Our next article is this one, Hannah Landecker's The Antibiotic Resistance in the Biology of History. Note that phrase. She means something specific about the biology of history. This is kind of significant. So I'm going to have you guys read this and come up with your own comments. There's a couple of things I thought I should probably talk about just to help frame it. Some things that you probably haven't been exposed to before. One is the idea of biopolitics. So we've already talked a little bit about Foucault elsewhere. Foucault comes up a lot. Biopolitics is an idea that comes out of Foucault, Michel Foucault. And one of the central sort of focuses of Foucault's work is how essentially like power works through watching. She refers to this as the carceral eye, or sometimes the gaze. And in fact, and that's G-A-Z-E, the gaze. And in fact, like if you hear, if you read stuff on things like portrayals of female bodies, right? They'll talk a lot about the masculine gaze, and that's a feminist application of Foucault. So the idea is that by being watched and having a catalog created is how modern societies enact power. It's the action of power is this action of watching. And then, so particularly like Foucault studies this transition from very different systems of power. We talked about, I believe we talked about earlier in the class, his stuff on the creation of prisons. Prisons don't exist prior to the modern era, to the 1700s. And when they and so we get this transfer of this change in this way of thinking about human behavior. Before that, nobody thinks about the world as having criminals. Instead, what you get is you get often illegal acts are thought of as acts against a leader, acts against the king, and the king has retribution against you. But you're not a criminal. You just are the person who acted against the king. And instead we have a language of somebody being a criminal, that being a part of who they are. It's in their biology, it's in their socialization, and prisons are essentially a form of treatment that grows out of that. Well, how do you identify somebody as a criminal? How do you know that they're a criminal? You figure these things out by watching, and that's essentially what police do. Before, policing did not involve police as we know them today. They involved people who were called inquisitors. Inquisitors were simply trying to figure out what happened. Often it wasn't individualized in its focus, where instead what police do is they drive around and they create a record. They watch. And if we are recorded by the police as doing something illegal, we are arrested, right? We become criminals. We become deviant. And so it's not that Foucault necessarily thinks that there's something wrong with policing or anything like that. That's not necessarily the point. The point is more that if we want to understand how power works, we need to think of it as rather than just there being cops, we all kind of become cops. We become cops for each other. In modernity, we live in a society where norms have a sort of oppressive weight, and we are constantly policing one another. He refers to this as the capillaries of power. Power doesn't exist in the big institutions that we think they do, but instead, the prison has become the model for all the ways in which we live. And all these ways in which we watch our behavior and think about who we are. This ties in with his later work on biopolitics, where Foucault talks about how the way in which we think about our bodies, right, becomes interlaced with this sort of carceral authority. So in essence, we become sort of these police of ourselves. We constantly think about, and we think about orientations towards food is a good example of this. People in the past were not particularly overweight compared to people now, but their orientation towards food was very different. It was a very social orientation. It had a lot to do with interacting around food with other people, and how you ate in some ways was sort of ritualized. Nowadays, when we think about food, we think about things like caloric intake, what chemicals are in it, whether it has antioxidants, things like that. So essentially what we've done is we've taken what before was not this sort of policed, watched, calculated act and turned it into one. We think about our bodies in terms of measuring our deviance, right, from some sort of idyllic model of what a body should look like. We turn a medical gaze, this would be his language, right? We turn the medical gaze towards ourselves. So Foucault's very interested in that idea of biopolitics. Biopolitics has become a very common way of talking about the body in sociology, as well as other disciplines. So we see that popping up a lot. The other idea is, kind of brings us back to something we talked about before. It brings us back in a couple points in the semester. I talked about not really believing in the divide between nature and nurture. That I generally see, in general, often sociology sees biology and our socialization working in concert with one another. That they're not oppositions, that they're instead two things going on at once, if you will. And actually, and you see a lot of that in this article. In this article, there isn't a wall between you and the world. So it's not that you are a being independent, right? It ends with your skin and then you have the environment. That's not usually how, or increasingly so, it's not how sociologists view the world. But there's actually, if you will, very, there's far more connection, right, going on. complicated connections going on between you and your environment. And that involves your biology. So your biology itself is also a reflection of these sort of large, complicated flows of the environment. And the physical environment is no longer removed from the human. So you aren't inseparable from your environment, but the environment is not inseparable from you. It's one of the reasons why it's hard to say that there's, is it biology, is it socialization, right? Like, you're not a being who begins and ends with your skin. So within this idea, another way of putting this is when it comes to the physical environment, is that we live in something that is nowadays often called the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is the idea that the physical environment is no longer removed from human action. There is no nature. Nature is kind of over. That nature itself is intertwined and intermixed with human beings to a degree that you can't tell when one begins and one ends. If you were to go up into the Arctic, there are people who are consuming foods that have DDT in them from farm fields that were sprayed in Iowa. There's no natural preserved place separate. And essentially what our article is doing is it's looking at disease through this lens. How is it that bacteria are this reflection of the Anthropocene? How is it that bacteria are as much human as they are nature now, particularly as a result of sort of mass industrial constructions of antibiotics? So take a good look at the article, figure out what you want to say about that. Just also kind of like connecting it to something that's going on right now is the pandemic that we're in. There's been a lot of stuff being released in the news, maybe you guys have seen it, about the origins of the virus and environmental degradation. And this is true of the COVID-19 virus. It's also true of some previous viruses that sort of swept things like the bird flu or the swine flu. That animals are losing their ability to resist and ward off viruses as a result of the environment getting harder to live in. So we're having more extreme viruses within animals crossing over into human beings. How we would naturally want to think about something like a virus is that, like, I am me, the virus comes from the environment, it attacks me, and then we fight, in essence, over the space of my body. How if we were to read this through the article that we're looking at, how you would instead want to envision it, is you would want to envision it as, I have altered the environment to the point, right, that this pandemic was created, right, through that alteration of the environment, and now that virus is affecting my body. So it's a lot of ways it's like this fuzzy returned back to me. And so it's, in essence, it's trying to look at, like, what are all the weird complications, the fuzziness, the lines being drawn between the resistance of bacteria, right, and the construction of antibiotics. So take a good look at that. And report back on your findings. I look forward to reading your discussions. Other than that, have a great week. Also, I want to say that I know that a lot of people that I know in different parts of the country are now beginning to be directly affected by what's going on in the world. So directly affected by the virus. So I want to say, in moving forward, if you guys are having issues within your family or something like that, please communicate with me. Put the needs, those very important needs, well above that of what's going on in the class. Just communicate with me so that I know how to take appropriate action. So I just wanted to throw that out there again. I know I was probably very close to what I iterate almost every week, but have a great week. Talk to you soon. Bye.